So I've entitled my presentation this morning, it's kind of a strange topic. The title I've decided to give it is Men Like Trees Walking. Now some of you will recognize that phrase because you are familiar with the passage that I'm going to focus on. But as I proceed this morning, you will get a better understanding as to why I have chosen that topic. So, men like trees walking. Now, there's a story in the Bible, a kind of unusual story, in the ministry of Jesus, which has been a puzzle to me for a long time. Every time I heard this story, I could not understand it. And the explanations that were given to me just did not sit right with me. Now I'm talking about the story of the man who Jesus healed in 2 stages. And I have often believed, I have often heard it proposed, and I myself believed, that this story was a story that had to do with an issue of faith. What I've heard, and we're going to look at the story, what I've heard is that the man's faith was so weak. He was in such a poor condition spiritually that Jesus had to try 2 times in order to heal him completely. But after as I said, this explanation, among others that I have heard over the years, just did not sit well with me. It was not compatible with what I know and understand about the way that God does things. So, having looked at the story more carefully, I have come to the conclusion that this could not be the case at all, where the man's faith was so weak that Jesus had to try twice. I now fully believe that the whole incident, the whole story, was a deliberate act by Jesus, which has a much deeper meaning than we have been able to see up until this point. And I'm hoping that as we look at the story today, we will be able to gain some insight into what really happened, why things happened the way they did, and how those occurrences are relevant to us today. Now, I am sure all of you, or most of you, will admit that you have had questions about that story. So I'm going to go to the passage. It's found in Mark chapter 8. And I'm going to just quickly read. It's just 3 verses, verses 22 to 25. It says, And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. After that he put his hands upon his eyes again, and made him look up. And he was restored, and saw every man clearly. Now I have a quick diagram here. If you look at this diagram here that I uploaded, it gives this story in 3 pictures. The blind man is brought to Jesus in picture 1. He is unable to see anything at all. Jesus puts some spit on his eyes and touches him. And in this stage of the process, he says that he can see men like trees walking. He is not able to see clearly. Everything is blurry. Jesus touches him again in stage 3, and now he is able to see clearly. Now, as I said, it's an unusual story which I've often had questions about. Here is what many people have generally believed. As I said before, Jesus had to make 2 attempts because the man's faith was so weak. Jesus tried the first time and he got partial healing because his own faith was not able to grasp the miracle. And I've heard some preachers use this passage to teach importunity. They say that when you are praying about something, or praying specifically about the sick, you should continue to pray as long as it takes, because what God is teaching in this passage is importunity. They say that if Jesus had to try twice, imagine how much more you and I, we should try 1,000 times. And now I'm not saying that when you're praying for the sick, you should not show importunity. But I'm saying that this is not what this passage is showing at all. And I'm going to show you why I have come to that conclusion. So this story is often used to teach us, or to impress upon us the importance of perseverance. But here is why I don't believe this. Let me give you a couple of reasons. First of all, throughout the ministry of Jesus, Jesus met many people who had little to no faith. On one occasion, I remember the father of a demoniac boy asking, Lord, he says, Lord, please help my unbelief. He knew that he did not have the faith that was necessary, and he asked Jesus to help his unbelief. Jesus met many people every day who had little to no faith. And on none of those occasions did he have to try twice. Jesus met people who Jesus healed people based on the faith of others, where the person who was healed had no faith at all. For example, in the case of the centurion comes and he asks for healing for his servant. And Jesus says, your faith is what is going to cause this miracle to come about. The servant is at home lying in bed. He doesn't even know what his master is doing. And the Bible says in that same hour, immediately, he receives healing. He doesn't even know what is happening with Jesus and the centurion. But the faith of the centurion heals him, even though his faith has no part to play in it. And it did not happen in stages. Same thing with the Syrophoenician woman who came and petitioned Jesus to heal her daughter. The daughter was at home sick. She had no part to play in the whole thing in terms of faith. She didn't even know what was happening. Yet because of the faith of her mother, Jesus was able to heal her immediately. And thirdly, Jesus worked miracles in situations where there was zero faith. I'll give you an example. Jesus raised a man from the dead who had been dead for 4 days. He had started to decompose and rot. And I'm speaking, of course, about Lazarus. How much faith did Lazarus had when Jesus raised him from the dead? Zero. How many times did Jesus have to try? He spoke once, and the miracle took place immediately. What I'm saying is, I am submitting to you that there is no situation in which God has to try twice in order to succeed. If God decides to heal somebody, even if the faith of that person is negative 1,000, when God decides to wrought this miracle, it happens immediately. God doesn't have to try twice. It is impossible that he can try, and because your faith is weak, he doesn't get the success that he wants. He has to try again. That's absolutely impossible. So these are some of the considerations that always troubled me when I heard this story explained as a case where Jesus made 2 attempts because of the man's faith. I am saying to you that there is no other incident like this in the entire ministry of Jesus where he healed somebody in stages because the person's faith was too weak for him to do it immediately. I hope you're following what I'm saying so far. So when I take all of these things into consideration, it is clear to me that this was a deliberate act by Jesus, and that a very important lesson is involved. Here is what I will tell you straight off the bat, because I was really looking at this story over and over, and I came to the conclusion that this particular miracle, from start to finish, was a parable. It was a parable. that Jesus was telling. And I'm going to show you why I believe that. Now, one of the things that we have to do when we are looking at certain things in the Bible is to consider context. Many times we don't do that, but that is a very important principle to understand when studying the Bible. We have to look at the context. And when it comes to this story, I never looked at the context before, but it's there and it's very clear. Look at let's look at the verses that precede this story to understand the context of what happened. So we'll go back to verse 15 of Mark 8, and I'll just read a few verses here. It says, and he charged them, speaking to the disciples now, he charged them saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he saith unto them, and I want you to listen to the words of Jesus carefully here now. Why reason ye, because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not? Yet neither understand? Have you your heart yet hardened? And look at this phrase now. Having eyes, see ye not? And having ears, hear ye not? And do ye not remember? When I break the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? They say unto him, 12. And when the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. And he asks them a very important question, which really summarizes the entire context now. And he said unto them, how is it that ye do not understand? I hope that you are seeing what is happening here now. Here is the context. Jesus was gently chastising his disciples for having been around him every day, and yet still they did not understand his methods and his ways. He was disappointed in their lack of spiritual discernment and perception. And I am suggesting to you that it is no coincidence that the healing of the blind man took place immediately afterwards. The very next verse we see the story, and it takes place in the context of this rebuke. I am suggesting to you that this particular healing was directly related to this incident. So Jesus just chastises them for having lack of spiritual perception. And let's look at the story again now in the context of that. He just chastises them for having no spiritual perception. And then he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him and besought him to touch him. Now look at what happens now. Look at some things that Jesus does. The crowd, the multitude brings this blind man to Jesus. And this is something that happens every day. The crowds bring the sick, and Jesus heals them always in the presence of the multitudes. He always does it so that everybody can witness it. But on this occasion, he does something that is very unusual. Look at what the next verse says. It says, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. Very strange and unusual and uncharacteristic of how Jesus normally operates. The question is, why did he do this? Well, I'll give you my opinion. I believe that what Jesus was about to do was to be a lesson, not for everybody, and as it usually was. It was a specific lesson for the disciples on this occasion. And also I believe that it has a symbolic importance as well, which I will come to. But he led the man away from everybody. The only persons who were present now was the disciples. Because the lesson that he was going to teach next was for the disciples specifically. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. What was the man saying here in this condition? He was saying, I can see something. I can make out certain figures and shapes, but my vision is not clear. I cannot definitively describe what I'm seeing. Everything is blurry. In other words, the man was in the same condition that the disciples were in spiritually. He was in the same condition that Jesus had just chastised his disciples about being in. I hope you're following. After that, he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly. When Jesus was finished with him, he had perfect vision. I knew that when I started, you were seeing men like trees walking, but you're starting to understand a little more clearly what I'm saying now. I believe that the whole story of this blind man mirrored exactly the experience of the disciples. In what way? When Jesus found them, they were all blind men. All of them lived their entire lives under the gross darkness and the extreme legalism of the Jewish system and the Jewish form of religion, Judaism. The only thing they knew were works under the law. They knew of a God who loved the righteous but hated sinners. A God who was hard and cold and stern. When Jesus found them in this blindness, what did he do? He held them by the hand and led them away from that system. He led them away from the shackles and the darkness of the scribes and the Pharisees. He separated them from the traditions, the teachings, the practices, and the incorrect concepts which they had been brought up under. Same situation. And here's an important lesson that I want to point out from this first step that Jesus took in leading the blind man away from the crowd by the hand. In order for the master to take his people to higher heights in truth, what does he always do? Think about it. He always separates them from the crowd and from the system and from the establishment. Trace it all the way back to Abraham. God separated Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees. He separated the Israelites from the Egyptians. He separated the disciples from Judaism. And if you come further down in history, he separated the Reformers and the Protestants from Catholicism. And when those Protestants apostatized, he separated offshoots and reformers from those Protestants. And of course, we all know that ultimately, he will separate his true people from Babylon. So when the disciples started out, they were in the exact condition as this blind man. But as they walked with Jesus for 3.5 years, what started to happen? Their spiritual minds began to expand, and they occasionally saw flashes of light and gained greater understanding. But very often, which as was in the case just a few verses before, very often they couldn't see clearly, and things were blurry and confusing. As they walked with Jesus and observed his words and his deeds, slowly and gradually, their eyes began to be opened, and they started to see men like trees walking. Forms and shapes and outlines. On one occasion, Jesus asked, "Who do men say that I am?" And one said this, another said that. Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "My Father has revealed this to you." A flash of light. On another occasion, Philip says, "Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us." Jesus says, you are looking at him. Whatever you see in me, that's the Father. Another flash of light. Ultimately, John says, we beheld his glory. The glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. As they walked with the Master for 3.5 years, they could see certain things, but not clearly. They were in the same condition as the blind man. Part 2. As the disciples walked with Jesus, they could see men like trees walking. And Jesus bore with their ignorance. Sometimes he got discouraged. Like on this occasion when he chastised them gently. But he bore with their ignorance and their lack of perception patiently. And he himself told them that at that time there were things which they could not understand. But he promised that in the future they would see the truth clearly and that they would be given complete sight. In John chapter 16 verses 12 and 13 we see this message very clearly. What does Jesus say? He says, I have yet many things to say unto you, but what? But you cannot bear them now. In other words, he was saying to them, all you can see right now is men like trees walking. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, what will he do? He will guide you into all truth. In other words, he will open your eyes fully and you will see all things clearly, just like the blind man. I am suggesting to you, brothers and sisters, that this particular miracle of Jesus was really a parable to the disciples, which the master teacher used to illustrate their journey from start to finish. If you think about it, the master has just chastised us for not understanding and for having lack of perception. They were probably feeling a little discouraged after this kind of rebuke. And this was Jesus' way of encouraging them and letting them know that even though they were struggling to see and to understand now, they would eventually come to the place where everything would be made clear. They would see all things clearly. I believe that it was also a parable and a prophecy about the journey of the kingdom. I'm going to look at that as well. It was a parable about the journey of the kingdom and how Jesus would ultimately take his final church from out of total darkness and lead it step by step into all truth. So what am I saying? I am saying that this miracle, carried out and completed by Jesus in 2 stages, was purposeful and deliberate. Why? Because he is the master teacher and he can use the most unlikely scenarios and situations in order to teach the most remarkable lessons. So this whole miracle, this healing done by Jesus, was really a parable. And when I understand this, I feel that this is the correct interpretation. It could not be that Jesus tried to heal the man and didn't have the success that he had hoped for because the man's faith was too weak, so he had to try again. Now, let's look a little bit more closely at how this parable was fulfilled among the disciples. You know, after Jesus was raised from the dead, many of the things which were strange and mysterious to the disciples became clear and their eyes were fully opened. For example, after his resurrection in Luke 24 and verse 45, it says, Then opened he their understanding that they might understand the scriptures. Things were revealed to them which they never saw before. In John chapter 12 and verse 16, it says, These things understood not his disciples at the first. But when Jesus was glorified, then remembered they that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things unto him. After the resurrection, their eyes began to see things far more clearly. It's like when I was a child, I remember very clearly. My dad used to take myself and my brother into the yard with him whenever he was doing any chores, and we would have to sit there and repeat our 2 times tables. I remember that one very clearly. And he would have us there. 2 ones are 2, 2 twos are 4, 2 threes are 6. And I remember feeling the torture, and it felt like complete torture. And I just could not understand why this was so hard. So he said, write it on a piece of paper. And I wrote it down. I was about 7 years old at the time, or 6. And I wrote at the bottom of the page, this is so hard. Now, a couple of years ago, I found that piece of paper, crumpled and old and dirty, but it was with the same words at the bottom. This is so hard. And I looked at the 2 times table, which I can say in my sleep now. And I wondered, why was it so difficult? It was because my understanding and my perception was not yet opened. But now, I have a full picture of everything. I mean, my 2 times table that is just child's play. So I'm saying that this was the same kind of situation with the apostles. When Jesus came in the form of the Comforter, he anointed their eyes with eye salve, and the things that they could not understand before, the things that only looked like men like trees walking before, became clear. I suppose in a sense, what Jesus said was fulfilled among them when he said that they would be led into all truth. Now, I understand this phrase to be, we have to qualify what we mean by all truth. Right? I think that, well, did the apostles know everything and unravel all the mysteries of the kingdom and of the scriptures? Absolutely not. Even in that great church, there was dissent and disagreement and misconceptions still. There were still people in the church who could not let go of the law of Moses. They were still legalists. There were still people in the church who could not let go of traditions and ancient practices. There were big debates about circumcision. And there were even people in the church who still had traces of racism in them. Some of them still struggled to fraternize and mingle with Gentiles. In addition to that, none of them had a clue about the things written in the book of Daniel. And of course, Revelation had not even been written yet. So when I say that the disciples understood all truth, what I believe is that they had a clear understanding of all truth, which was relevant and necessary for the time. The Spirit of truth led them into all truth that was needed at that time. So they were fully united in one accord as it relates to the fundamental truths of the gospel. And what are those? Jesus is the Son of God. All of them were united in that truth and all that it implies. Jesus being the Son of God means that he was the one who is like God. If you want to know what God is like, look at his Son. They were all united in that truth. They were all united in the truth that if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, thou shalt be saved. You cannot be saved by the law of Moses or by circumcision or by anything else except by believing in Jesus. They were all united in those truths. Now here is something very important that I want to point out to you. Before the apostles were qualified to take the gospel to the world, they had to go through the same 3 stages that the blind man went through. Think about that. They had to go through the same 3 stages that the blind man went through. Let me just share my screen here again. All right, so first of all, they had to be led out of the blindness of legalism, traditionalism, and Judaism. Now, in the context of those days, Judaism and the Jewish system would be classified as Babylon. And in that system, they were completely blind men. They were babies. And Jesus came and took them by the hand, just like he did with the blind man, and led them away from the crowd, away from the system, out of the city. You see how amazing the parables of Jesus are? They had to now transition through the stage where they could see vague glimpses of truth, but not clearly. They could only see men like trees walking, when their eyes were partially opened. In this condition, they were children. At this stage, they were not yet fit to take the gospel to the world. They had to come to stage 3, which is when Jesus touched their eyes again and they could see and understand all truths clearly. They were now adults. It is important to remember that. At stage 2, they were not fit to carry the gospel. At stage 1, they were not fit to carry the gospel. They had to go through all 3 stages that the blind man did. And Jesus was showing them that by that miracle that he worked. Now, of course, when they were brought to this place and the Spirit of truth had led them into all truth, then they were ready to carry out the greatest mission of their lives. They could not do it when they could only see men like trees walking. So now that they had come to this place, it was time. And Jesus gave them the greatest mission of their lives. In Mark 16 and verse 15, he sends them out to carry out the Great Commission, to preach the gospel to all the world and to do the impossible, to take a strange, unknown teaching into a world full of unbelief and full of strange religions and doctrines. He sends them out there and he does something which will ensure that everybody will have to look at them. Everybody will have to turn their attention to them. Everybody will have to pay attention to what they are saying. And we are told what that is in Acts chapter 1 verse 8. He promises to give them power to fulfill this mission. But as I am saying and I am emphasizing, they had to go through the 3 stages of the blind man first before they were fit and qualified for this mission. So, what I want to touch on now is how this parable will be fulfilled among us. Because one of the beauties about this story is that while I understand that it was a lesson to the disciples, I see a lesson to us today as well. I see a lesson to the church and the kingdom as well. And it just blows my mind how Jesus uses the simplest of things to teach the most profound concepts. How does it apply to us? Well, sadly, as we all know, the great apostolic church descended into darkness and total blindness. And Paul tells us that even in his days, the wrath had already begun, right? In 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 7, he tells us that the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Even in the days of Paul, something was coming into the church which was corrupting it. And in Acts chapter 20 and verse 29, he tells us, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock." So there was awareness among the disciples, Paul specifically, that the church would descend into utter and complete darkness, or blindness would probably be a better word. And as the great apostles died off, the leadership of men took over the church, and strange doctrines of devils were set up as fundamental edicts. The truth was completely distorted and replaced by teachings like Sunday worship, eternally burning hell, the Trinity, confession of sins to priests, the immortality of the soul, the worship of saints. I mean, a myriad of false teachings. During this period of time, a man could lose his life if he was caught with a Bible. The Word of God became cheap and meaningless. And the truth and the Spirit of truth was completely taken out of the way. In fact, this period of time was so dark and terrible that today we refer to it as the Dark Ages, as you all know, right? In Joel chapter 1 and verse 4, we are given a description of this period of time using imagery that is very graphic and vivid. Joel says, he says that at that time, that which the palmer worm hath left hath the locust eaten, and that which the locust hath left hath the cankerworm eaten, and that which the cankerworm hath left hath the caterpillar eaten. Total and utter blindness. The church fell into a condition of gross spiritual darkness and deprivation, in so much that the true knowledge of God was all but completely eradicated. Back to the state of the blind man, who is totally incapable of seeing. That is where the church went. But how did Jesus respond? He responded in the same way he did with the blind man. Just like in the parable, he took his people by the hand and he led them away from the crowd and away from the systems and away from the falsehoods. And I'm suggesting to you that for the last 2,000 years, this is how Jesus has led his church, separating small underground movements from the systems and establishments. Right? You look at people like the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the reformers like Huss and Jerome and Wycliffe, Luther, Tyndale, Melanchthon, people like this. Small movements. God separated them from the systems. But in truth and in fact, for the 2,000 years, these men and these movements were never able to see the truth clearly. What they saw were little glimpses, little patches and blurry outlines of the truth. But many of them, if you check it out, many of them were still Trinitarians. Many of them believed in eternally burning hell. Many of them still held on to a lot of the pagan teachings of Roman Catholicism. They were children, and all they could see, you know the phrase I'm going to use, all they could see were men like trees walking for 2,000 years. And as these little movements separated themselves, they grew and developed, and they fell into error and formed themselves into denominations dictated and run by men. What did the Spirit of Truth continue to do? The Spirit continued to call people out from among those systems, and out from among those systems, and this continues even until today. The principle that Jesus established in the parable is that before the blind can begin to see the truth, and before rays of light can begin to break through the darkness, they must first be separated from those who are themselves blinded by traditions and the leading of men. And as I pointed out earlier, God's true movements always have their genesis in separation. Always. They are always separating from blindness. And he showed us this in the parable of the blind man. So today, in our current situation and in our current setting, how does what I am saying apply to us today? And what meaning does it have to us? Well, I believe that for the last 2,000 years, as I said, the church has been unable to pass step 2. We have basically been stuck at stage 2. We have been able to see little forms and shapes and figures of the truth, men like trees walking, but we have not been able to go to stage 3. Not yet. And all over the world, we see little groups like ours, offshoots, who have broken away from the nominal systems. When I was just trying to do a list of them in my head, and there are a lot. Many I don't even know about. The good thing is that we can see critical and fundamental truths returning today among many of these groups. And there is no doubt in my mind that the Spirit is doing something, and that under the hand of the Master, the eyes of his people are being opened slowly but surely. We have been able to see men like trees walking, and the images are maybe becoming a little clearer. But I'm encouraging you, and I'm encouraged by the fact that based on the parable, the time is about to come upon us when the church is to see all things clearly. And the Spirit of truth is about to lead us collectively into all truth at last. This is the promise of the parable. The things which have been hidden are about to be revealed. You know, all these things that we are coming to discover and to understand. The mysteries of Daniel and Revelation. Things that we could never have grasped before. That seem so inexplicable and so confusing are becoming clear to our eyes. Things which even the apostles did not understand are being revealed to us. I am suggesting that the final stage of the kingdom is about to begin. And as gross darkness covers the people, the glorious light of the Father and the Son is about to break with dazzling splendor upon the whole earth. As I said before, I was looking at the myriads of groups that exist around the world. You know, you have groups that have broken away from the church. And then you have groups that have broken away from those groups. And everywhere you go, there's a little group that has formed. And here's another little group over there. I was just trying to do a list of some of the ones I know. We have this group which is Open Face. I know of another one, you know, Allen Stump has a group which is Our Firm Foundation, I believe. Then there's Daniel Mesa has another group. There's Revelation 14 verse 12, I believe. That's Brother Nada and Brother Imad's group. There's Living Water. That's Brother Figure's group. There's Christ Our Foundation. That's Brother Johannes' group. There's Berean Ministries. That's Brother Barry and Sister Jessie's group. There's another one here called Philagape. I mean, I could spend all day listing them. And what I ask myself, you know, if you check it out, there may be little differences between these groups, little discrepancies, little idiosyncrasies. What on earth? How on earth will all of these various divisions and factions be brought to the place where they all see the same truth clearly? And then if you include the church, the true brethren in all the denominations around the world, and you consider all of them coming to see the same truth as well, I ask myself the question, how is something like this going to happen? And the answer to that question is, I have absolutely no idea. But I believe that God will do something remarkable. Something which is above the scope of men. Something miraculous and divine which will compel the entire church. And I mean both the wheat and the tares. It will compel them to face the truth. Those who are His will accept the truth, and those who are not will reject it. But according to the parable, it is the Master's touch which will finally give clear sight where there was blindness before. And only by His touch are His people to be at last united and perfected in one truth. So what I'm saying is that I believe that the kingdom has to go through the same three stages which the blind man did and which the apostles did. We can look and see that the kingdom has been going through the first two stages. They are to go through all three stages. Let me just show my diagram here again. So just like the blind man and the apostles, the kingdom must first be led out of the blindness of legalism, traditionalism, and denominationalism. I would say they need to come out of Babylon. Anybody who is in Babylon is in blindness. And the kingdom in this condition were babies. They had to be called out of this blindness. And for 2,000 years, Jesus kept calling His people out of this condition, calling them out of it. And as they came out of it and apostatized, He called people out of those apostatized movements as well. They have to transition through the stage where they can only see men as trees walking. They can only see semblances and outlines of truth, but they can't grasp the core and the husk of the truth. For 2,000 years, this is what we have seen happening. And I believe that the kingdom has been transitioning between stage 1 and stage 2 for the last 2,000 years. And Paul describes stage 2 in Ephesians 4 and verse 14 in this way. He says that we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine. For 2,000 years, the kingdom has been transitioning between being babies and children. Stage 1 and 2. But Jesus in the parable teaches that ultimately He will touch the eyes of the blind again, and they will come to see all things clearly. They must come to stage 3 where they understand and see all truth clearly. And Paul backs up Jesus' parable and emphasizes this in Ephesians 4 and verse 13. He says we must all come in the what? In the unity of the faith. The eyes of the blind will be opened completely, and all of God's true people will see all things clearly. No longer men like trees walking, but all things clearly. They must come to the knowledge of the Son of God. And ultimately, they must grow up to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. They must grow up to be adults. Same 3 stages that the blind man went through. And then, just like the apostles were ready to carry out their greatest mission when they had come to stage 3, it will be the same with the kingdom. When God's people have been perfected in one spirit, in one faith, and one truth, and when they can see all things clearly, then it will be time to carry the gospel to the world one last time. Then the collective body will possess all truth, which is relevant for the time. You know, I have always dreamed about this time when we carry the gospel to the world. And many times there were times when I believed that the time was now. But you know what I've come to understand? At stage 1 we weren't ready. We weren't fit. At stage 2 we were not ready. We were not fit. We must come to stage 3. And Jesus taught this in the parable of the blind man. And now I understand that before you can be given adult responsibilities, you must first grow up to be an adult in the kingdom. The church must grow up to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ before it is fit to carry the gospel to the world. And I believe that we are on the cusp of seeing all things clearly. And when this happens, it will be time to take the gospel to the world one last time. Let me show my slide one more time. Now, the disciples had all truth for the time. The final church will be given all truth for the time. It will be the gospel, but it will be the gospel expanded, improved, and delivered in a way that it has never been seen before. Now everybody knows this passage that I have on the screen here. You know, then John says, I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel. So the message that will be carried by this angel is the same message that the apostles preached. Jesus is the Son of God. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. But now the church must come to all truth above. They must see all things clearly above and beyond what the apostles saw. Because now there are elements that are added to the everlasting gospel which the apostles did not know about and could not preach. We all know what they are. The first angel's message says that the hour of his judgment is come. The apostles could not preach that because I don't even know if many of the apostles understood about a judgment of the kingdom to come. In any case, it was far from their time, so they could not preach that. Another element of the message which will be preached at the end says that Babylon is fallen. The apostles could not preach that. In the iteration of Babylon that we are referring to, it had just started to form in the church in the form of the mystery of iniquity. So the apostles couldn't preach that Babylon is fallen. They couldn't preach anything about Babylon either. And of course, the third element of the message that we will preach has to do with the beast and his image and his mark. Only John among the apostles, maybe Paul to some extent, understood that there would be anything having to do with any beast and any mark. So the gospel will return and it will be preached one last time to the world in a way that not even the apostles could preach it. So what I'm saying is, we have been stuck at stage 2, but there is an expansion of the all truth. There is an expansion of the all things that Jesus promised to reveal to us. There are things that the last church must come to understand, which the apostles never knew about. And until we come to this place where we have been led into all truth, we are not fit to carry the gospel. And this is what Christ has been preparing his church for. He has been slowly but surely leading us away from seeing men like trees walking to seeing all truth clearly. And it excites me to think that we are on the very cusp of this finally being fulfilled. Then it will be time for the final prophecy to be fulfilled. In Matthew 24 and verse 14, Jesus says, "This gospel shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." Just like the apostles, we will be given an impossible task to do in a world that is full of technology, full of social media, full of million-dollar religions and denominations that have far more power and influence than we do. But just like the time of the apostles, he will give something which will force the world to listen to the final gospel. He will give, in Revelation 11 and verse 3, he promises power to carry the gospel. As you can see from my chart here, it's the exact thing repeating itself again. First with the apostles, 3 stages of the blind man, then the gospel is carried to the world with power. Finally with the kingdom, 3 stages of the blind man, then the gospel is to be carried to the world with power. It's amazing how our Master teaches the things that we need to know. I hope that I have not confused you today and that you have been able to follow what I'm trying to say and keep up. I want to emphasize again that it is not possible to carry the gospel. It's not possible. We are not fit for the work at stage 1 or stage 2. And that is the mistake that we have made sometimes. We have been impatient and thinking that now is the time. We must come to the 3rd stage like the apostles did. And then we will see all things clearly. No longer will we see men like trees walking, but we will see all men clearly. And I just want to close off with a passage from Daniel which we're all familiar with. Of course, we all understand that it's this prophecy was in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 10. This prophecy was speaking specifically about understanding the book of Daniel. It says, "The wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But I'm going to apply this to all truth as well." But it says that the wise shall understand. They will not always see men like trees walking, but they will come to see all things clearly. And when this happens, then it will be time for the greatest, or one of the greatest prophecies in the Bible to be fulfilled. I know that if you are like me, it excites you to see that truth is growing. I don't want to use the word rapidly, but I would use the word steadily. We are seeing truth steadily and clearly week by week. And it's an indication to me that something is about to happen. and that excites me. So I'm going to stop here. I hope that I have not confused you, as I said, and that you were able to get a little more insight into this story and what it truly means, because I know that when I looked at it, it was an eye-opener for me.
Amen.
So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Thank you for your time and your attention. And may we all continue to grow in His love and in His truth. Amen.